There is something happening right now, in the quiet of wherever you are. The lights are low, your body is still, and yet, somewhere behind your eyes, something is still moving, turning things over, replaying a conversation, running through tomorrow, reaching for what hasn't happened yet, or circling what can't be undone. You have done everything you were supposed to do today, and still, the mind will not let you go. If that sounds familiar, you are not broken. You are not doing rest wrong. You are not weaker than the people who seem to fall asleep the moment their head touches the pillow. You are not someone who needs to try harder. You are simply someone whose inner life has been waiting all day for the noise to stop so it can finally speak. Tonight, we are going to listen to it together. Carl Jung spent his entire career inside exactly this territory, the part of the mind that keeps moving when everything else goes still. He called it the unconscious. And he believed that most of what makes human beings suffer is not the world outside them, but the war they have been quietly waging against their own inner life. Let your shoulders drop for a moment. Let the weight of the day settle into whatever is beneath you. The questions we will explore tonight are not new. They are not productivity techniques, or morning routines, or strategies for becoming a better version of yourself by a particular date. They are the same questions that kept Jung himself awake, writing by lamplight in a stone tower in Switzerland, long after the world had gone to sleep. In 1913, Carl Jung sat down in his study in Zurich with a blank journal. He was 40 years old. He had just ended his friendship and working relationship with Sigmund Freud, the most powerful figure in psychology. His professional reputation was uncertain. His internal landscape was turbulent in ways he could not easily explain, and he was beginning to hear things, not voices in any clinical sense, but images, pressures, figures that surfaced from somewhere below ordinary thought. One day, he seemed to hear the voice of a woman inside him, skeptical and critical, offering commentary on everything he did. A lesser man might have concluded he was losing his mind. Jung did something else entirely. He listened. He began writing down what the inner figures said. He drew pictures of what they showed him. He painted illuminated pages in the manner of medieval manuscripts. He entered, deliberately and with every tool available to his psychological intelligence, the depths of his own unconscious. For years, he showed this work to almost no one. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. He was not escaping. He was going deeper. And what he found in that darkness would become the foundation of everything he ever taught about the human mind. There is a reason your mind gets louder when the world goes quiet. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something in you has been waiting all day for the conditions that make it possible to speak. And here is the thing I want you to hold gently as we begin. A question we will return to near the end of this conversation, when we have built enough ground beneath us to stand on it. There are two kinds of thinking. One kind exhausts you. It circles and loops and manages and anticipates. The other kind heals you. It goes down rather than around. It makes contact with what has been waiting. Jung spent a lifetime learning the difference between them. And by the time this night is over, you will understand what he found. Notice the weight of your body right now, the heaviness of your legs, your hands, the back of your head against the pillow. You do not have to fix anything tonight. You do not have to solve anything or resolve anything or arrive anywhere in particular. You only have to listen. This is where we begin. But before we do, one more thing. One thing to hold very loosely, carried along beneath everything else that follows. The person who presses play on a video like this, in the dark, in the quiet, at an hour when the world has finally gone still enough to allow it, that person is not doing something passive. They are making a small but genuine act of turning toward their own inner life. That turning is what every psychological tradition, every wisdom tradition, every serious thinker who ever sat with the question of what makes a human life genuinely livable was pointing toward. You don't have to do it perfectly. You don't have to stay awake for all of it. You don't have to understand every idea or agree with every framing. You only have to be here, and you already are. This is where we begin. Chapter 2. Why detachment feels so hard. Think about a thought you have been trying to let go of. Not the biggest one, just one. The kind that comes back every few days or every few hours. The kind that wears different clothes but carries the same weight. You have told yourself to stop thinking about it. You have tried distraction. You have tried busyness. You have tried sleep itself as a kind of escape, and still it returns. Jung would look at that thought and say something surprising. He would say that the thought is not the problem. The problem is that you have been trying to release something you were never fully allowed to hold. Detachment, in the Jungian sense, does not mean not caring. It means something almost opposite. It means caring so honestly, so completely, that the thing no longer needs to fight for your attention. It means giving the feeling full acknowledgement rather than partial management. It means saying, yes, this is real, this matters, I am not going to look away from it, and discovering that when you stop looking away, the grip loosens on its own. Here is a way to picture it. Imagine a river running fast over stones. Now imagine a child pressing both palms against the current, trying to stop it. Her arms ache. The water roars around her fingers. The river does not yield. The river does not care. Detachment is not the child fighting the river. Detachment is the child sitting on the bank and watching, not numb, not indifferent, watching. The water still flows. The current is still real, but she is no longer bruised by it. Jung believed the reason detachment feels so hard is that we have confused it with abandonment. We think that if we stop gripping something, we are betraying it. Betraying the person, the dream, the version of ourselves we were supposed to become, as though the grip itself is proof of how much we care, but the grip is not love. The grip is fear. Let your jaw soften for a moment. Let the muscles around your eyes release. There is a man I want you to imagine. He spent 30 years building a business. He knew every employee by name. He stayed late on Fridays, not because the work demanded it, but because the building felt safe in a way his house never quite did. The routine was reliable. The title was legible. The role told him who he was. Then the business was sold, not his choice. And suddenly, on a Tuesday morning with no alarm, he sat in his kitchen and could not find himself anywhere in the room. He tried not to think about it. He filled the hours with tasks, with news, with coffee that he refilled 3 times and never really drank. He said he was fine. He performed fine so consistently that even the people close to him began to believe it. What he could not do was sit with what had actually happened, because sitting with it felt like approving of it, like giving up, like agreeing that 30 years could simply end and be replaced by nothing. That is what Jung meant when he talked about attachment. We do not attach to things. We attach to the version of ourselves that the thing makes possible. And when we lose the thing, we do not know who we are without it. Detachment, then, is not about the external object at all. It is an interior act. It is the willingness to ask the question the ego most dreads: who am I when this is gone? That question is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be, but it is also the beginning of something Jung considered more valuable than anything the outer world can offer. And here is the quieter layer beneath that. Not all holding is fear. Sometimes holding is love trying to find a shape, and recognizing the difference between the grip of fear and the embrace of genuine care is the first step toward a freedom that does not require abandonment. We will come back to what he called the destination of that. Freedom. For now, notice what you might be holding more tightly than you need to. Just notice. There is no urgency. The night is long. Chapter 3, the ego's need for control. The ego does not trust the dark. That is not a criticism. It is just the nature of what the ego is. Jung understood the ego as the part of the mind that maintains your sense of being a continuous, coherent self. It knows your name. It remembers what you said last Tuesday. It keeps the narrative of you running in a consistent enough line that you can function in the world, make decisions, maintain relationships, and show up where you are expected. The ego is not the enemy. It is more like a devoted and slightly anxious night watchman. A night watchman who checks the locks every few hours and genuinely believes that if he stops checking, everything will fall apart. Who would like very much to sleep but cannot, because what would happen then? Control is the ego's primary language. It manages the world by sorting it into categories: safe and unsafe, known and unknown, mine and not mine. And it does this because uncertainty is not comfortable for the part of the mind responsible for keeping you together. When certainty is available, the ego feels safe. When certainty disappears, when the outcome is unclear, when someone behaves unpredictably, when the future becomes difficult to script, the ego's alert system activates. And at night, the alert system tends to run without interruption. Let your hands open slightly. Let the pressure in your fingers release. Think of someone at the height of their authority. A manager who has spent decades making the difficult calls. A parent who held everything together through difficult years with competence that others relied on. A community leader who is always the first person reached when something goes wrong. Now imagine that person alone, after hours, when no one needs them. The posture changes, the composure relaxes. And beneath all that reliable competence, there is a much smaller, much more uncertain person who still wonders, on certain evenings, if they have been doing it right. This is not weakness. This is the human condition beneath the performance. Jung saw it clearly in his clinical work. The most controlled people were often the most controlled by something invisible. The people who seemed to have everything managed were frequently the ones whose unconscious was knocking with the most insistence. Because the unconscious does not knock politely. When the ego refuses to engage with what lies below the surface, the unconscious finds other means of communication. Anxiety that seems to come from nowhere. Physical tension that no massage quite addresses. Recurring dreams that leave a residue of unease. Irrational irritation at something small, out of proportion to what actually happened. These are not malfunctions. They are messages. There is a body awareness available to you right now. Just feel the weight of your body in this moment, the places where it presses down, the places where it is completely held. You do not have to do anything with this. Just feel it. Jung's answer to the ego's need for control was not to eliminate the ego. He had no interest in destroying the night watchman. The night watchman serves a real purpose. His answer was to expand the self, to make the inner world large enough to include both the known and the unknown, the controlled and the wild, the persona that operates in the daylight and the shadow that moves in the dark. This expansion is not comfortable. It requires the ego to relinquish its position as the only authority, which is exactly what the ego resists. Something here is worth noting. There is something your mind has been protecting itself from in this quiet hour. Not tomorrow's practical concern, something older and quieter. We are moving toward it, slowly, together. The pace is not urgent. Let the night do its work. Chapter 4. Overthinking as inner conflict. Overthinking is not the problem. This is one of the most useful things Jung's work implies, even if he rarely stated it in such simple terms. The thought that won't leave, the scenario that replays 100 times, the conversation you have rewritten in your head more carefully than you ever write anything out in the actual world, none of that is your mind misbehaving. None of it is weakness or failure, or evidence that something is neurologically wrong. It is your mind doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is trying to resolve something that has not been resolved. The question worth asking, gently, without urgency, is, what is the thing that has not been resolved? And the answer, almost always, is not the thing the overthinking appears to be about. Picture a bedroom at 3 inches the morning. The clock reads 3:07. Someone lies on their back, staring at the ceiling. They are running through a conversation from earlier that day. Their colleague said something ambiguous. It could have been dismissive or it could have been neutral, and they cannot determine which. Or a friend did not respond to a message that was sent 3 hours ago. Or there was a moment at dinner when the table went slightly quiet and they couldn't locate the reason. They replay it, adjust the variables, introduce a new piece of information, run a different version, run it again. They tell themselves they are problem solving. They are being productive with their sleeplessness. But no solution ever arrives, because the mind is not actually trying to solve the problem on the surface. It is trying to solve a much older problem, one that sounds something like, am I safe here? Am I valued by this person? Am I seen? Those questions cannot be answered by the 3 a.m. version of the conversation. They can only be answered by the deeper layers of the self. Let your breath come naturally. Let the tension in your face release. Jung saw overthinking as a symptom of inner conflict, not a breakdown, but a dialogue that hasn't yet found its proper form. When something in the unconscious needs attention, and the conscious mind refuses to look at it directly, the unconscious wraps its message in a loop. It sends the same essential feeling up through slightly different corridors until you find the one that opens. The loop is not the problem. The loop is the signal, and the signal almost always is some version of this. There is something you are feeling that you have not yet allowed yourself to feel. Not a thought, a feeling. Sitting under the thought, older and more patient than any thought. There is a moment in many people's lives when they first encounter a therapist who asks them a deceptively simple question. Not, what are you thinking about? But, what are you feeling underneath what you're thinking? And the person opens their mouth and realizes, sometimes for the first time in years, that they don't quite know how to answer. The thinking has been so loud for so long that the feeling beneath it has become inaudible. This is what the overthinking was doing. It was keeping that feeling just below the level of conscious acknowledgement. Not deliberately. Not out of cowardice. But because the feeling, when it first arrived, was too much for the available space. There is a name for the process of turning toward that feeling rather than looping around it. We are building toward that name, chapter by chapter. For now, just hold the awareness. The thought that loops is pointing down, and down is where the work lives. Let your jaw soften. Let the night be spacious. Chapter 5: The Mask You Learned to Wear. You did not choose the first mask. It was fitted for you long before you had the vocabulary to question it, long before you understood that you were wearing one at all. A child learns very early what version of themselves is welcome in a room, what earns warmth, what earns disappointment, what makes the atmosphere safe and what makes it go cold. And that child, being intelligent and wired for connection above almost everything else, begins to shape themselves accordingly. Not through deliberate deception, through survival. By the time you are old enough to understand what is happening, the mask has been on so long that you can no longer feel the pressure of it. It feels like your face. This is what Jung called the persona. The persona is not simply pretending. It is the socially constructed layer of the self, the collection of attitudes, behaviors, roles and expressions that have been assembled over years, often decades, to navigate the world. The professional version of you, the competent parent version, the person who has it together version, the person who does not get too emotional at the wrong moment, who does not ask for more than seems appropriate, who keeps the difficult feelings for later, and later becomes never. None of this is evil. All of it made sense. The persona serves a real function in the world, but there is a cost that accumulates so gradually you rarely notice it happening. Let the weight of your body settle. Let your hands rest open. Think of a dressing room after a long and socially demanding evening. Someone removes their jacket. The posture they have been holding all night finally releases. Their face changes shape without them deciding to change it. The slight tightness around the eyes softens, and they sit for a moment in the quiet, looking in the mirror, before they become themselves again. That gap between the performance and the face is the gap Jung was most interested in. Because inside that gap lives the person who never quite made it into the room. The quieter version, the one with the feelings that didn't fit the occasion. The one who wanted to say something different, or sometimes nothing at all. Jung believed that the greatest danger of the persona is not that others will mistake it for you, it is that you will. There is a kind of exhaustion that is not about working too many hours or sleeping too few. It is the exhaustion of performing too consistently, of never quite letting the performance end, of being so good at being the version of yourself that people expect that you have genuinely lost track of what you wanted before the expectations arrived. That exhaustion is real. It is not weakness or ingratitude dressed as wisdom. It is the self asking, quietly, without drama, but with persistence, to be found. The question tonight, held gently rather than urgently, is this: what part of you has never had permission to appear? Not the mythologized hidden self, not some grand secret identity. Just the quiet piece that kept getting set aside, the preference you stopped expressing, the feeling you decided was not appropriate for the room, the interest you put down because it didn't fit the role you were building. That piece is still there. It has been patient, but it is not gone. And somewhere in the quiet of a night like this, it begins to remember that it belongs to you. Chapter 6: Persona and Social Survival. The persona is a masterpiece of human adaptation. This is worth saying clearly, because Jung is sometimes read as though he were criticizing the masks people wear. He was not. He was a clinician and an empiricist. He understood that human beings are social animals, and that social animals need social faces in order to function within the complexity of collective life. The problem is not the persona. The problem is what he called identification with the persona. There is a critical difference between putting on a coat and forgetting you are wearing one. Jung understood that every significant role in life generates its own persona. The doctor develops a doctor persona that conveys authority and steadiness in moments when patients need steadiness above all else. The mother develops a persona that holds the household's emotional climate in certain weathers. The respected elder develops a persona assembled from decades of being the person others turn to. These are not dishonest. They are functional. They allow the enormous, unmanageable complexity of inner life to be presented in a form the world can receive. But underneath every persona, the full psyche continues. The doctor goes home and becomes uncertain about her own children's minor fevers. The composed father parks in a hardware store lot on a Tuesday afternoon and cries without completely understanding why. The respected elder lies awake at 3 a.m., wondering whether the life they built reflected what they actually wanted, or only what seemed expected. The inner life does not respect the persona's boundaries. And what happens when the persona is treated not as a useful tool, but as the truth of the self? Let your breath be natural. Let your eyelids soften. Jung observed a consistent pattern in people who had over-identified with their persona. Their inner life did not disappear. It went underground. The emotions they could not express in their public role accumulated in the unconscious, like water finding its level behind a dam. And water, when it cannot flow where it chooses, will always find another way. For some people, that water finds its way through the body. A tension in the jaw that appears for no identifiable reason. A tightness across the chest that several specialists have been unable to explain. Sleep that should arrive but doesn't. For others, it finds its way through relationships. A sudden coldness toward a partner with no apparent cause. A disproportionate reaction to something small. A sense of distance from the people you are supposed to love most, from the life you built, as though watching it through glass. For others still, it finds its way through the body's chemistry, the exhaustion, the flatness, the inability to feel genuine pleasure in things that should produce it. None of this is malfunction. All of it is information. The persona, beautifully maintained, is doing its job. But what it cannot do is contain the whole of who you are. No persona can. The whole of a person is too large, too varied, too contradictory for any single role to hold. And eventually, the rest of who you are begins to insist. That insistence is not a crisis. Jung was clear about this. It is an invitation. An invitation to become large enough to include both the face the world knows and the face that lives beneath it, both the competent self and the uncertain one, both the steady one and the one that needs steadying, both the person who performs beautifully and the person who, at this hour, simply wants to rest. Chapter 7. The Shadow Beneath Politeness. Here is something that will feel familiar, even if no one has ever said it to you this directly before. The person you find most irritating is often carrying something you refuse to carry yourself. This is the shadow, not a dramatic concept. Not the evil twin of your better self. Not the repository of your worst impulses waiting to destroy you. Just the accumulated weight of everything you have decided you are not. Everything that did not fit the persona. Everything you were told, directly or indirectly, was unacceptable. By a parent, by a school, by a culture, by the subtle but relentless pressure of approval and disapproval that shapes the developing self long before the self is capable of questioning the process. The shadow contains ambition. If you were raised in a family that distrusted wanting too much, it contains softness. If you were raised in an environment that rewarded hardness above everything else, it contains anger. If your household required peace at any price, it contains neediness. If independence was the only quality that earned real approval, none of these traits disappeared when you decided you were not that kind of person. You placed them behind a door and told them to be quiet. The shadow is. What lives behind that door? Imagine a perfectly maintained garden. Every flower precisely trimmed. Every path edged cleanly. The whole arrangement tended with evident care and quiet pride. And then, in one corner of the garden, a section that has not been visited in years, overgrown, tangled, gone to its own devices. Not because the gardener is lazy, quite the opposite, but because there is something about that corner that has always felt wrong. Too dark, perhaps. Too much work to address. Or simply outside the version of the garden that was ever planned. One evening, the gardener finally walks there and finds, beneath the weeds, beneath the tangle, the flowers they had given up as dead years ago. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest where they are. The shadow is not your worst self. That is the misunderstanding that makes people afraid to look. The shadow is the unprocessed self, the parts that were stored rather than destroyed. And among those stored pieces are qualities that were not shameful at all, only inconvenient. Only too much for the people around you at the time they needed to be contained. Jung believed that the energy locked inside the shadow is not purely negative energy, it is life force. The vitality that was redirected into the persona because the persona needed fuel and found it in the parts of the self that were suppressed. When you deny your anger, the anger does not disappear. It provides energy for something else. Perfectionism, perhaps, or the relentless drive to be useful enough that no one will have reason to reject you, or a quiet, persistent contempt for the people who express the thing you are not permitted to feel. This is why shadow work is not a punishment. It is not a reckoning, it is a reclamation. What you retrieve from the shadow is not a wound to be healed. It is a piece of yourself that was thrown away because the situation at the time made it necessary. You can pick it back up, carefully, in the quiet of a night exactly like this one. Chapter 8. Why Repressed Traits Return. The unconscious has no concept of permanent disposal. This is both the frustrating and the strangely reassuring thing about Jungian model of the mind. What you push down does not disappear. It waits, and then, at the moment you are least defended, the moment when the careful architecture of your composure is slightly unguarded, it rises. This is why the person who spent decades being relentlessly cheerful sometimes collapses into an inexplicable depression. The sadness was never absent. It was stored. This is why the person who prided themselves on never getting angry sometimes erupts over something genuinely small. A tone of voice, a minor delay, something that in a less pressurized moment would have passed entirely unnoticed. The anger did not arrive from nowhere. It has been accumulating quietly and invisibly for years. And this is why, in the quiet hour before sleep, the feelings you managed all day finally get a turn. The management ends, and the cue, very patiently, begins to move. Notice the weight of your body right now. The places where it presses down, the places where it is held. Just notice. Jung described repression not as a deliberate choice, but as a kind of psychic housekeeping. We repress what we cannot yet integrate, what does not fit the self-image we are maintaining, what threatens the persona, what was, in some early context, genuinely too much to carry. The repression is not a character flaw. It began, usually, as wisdom, as the psyche's way of managing more than it could process at the time. But repression takes ongoing energy to maintain, perpetual, relentless energy. The kind of energy that, when you look at your life and try to account for why you are so tired, doesn't show up anywhere in the ledger. The person who has been managing their fear for 30 years is not just carrying the fear, they are carrying the enormous effort of keeping it invisible. The ongoing work of a dam that has to be tended every day, every hour, every quiet moment that might otherwise allow the water to find its level. That effort costs sleep. It costs presence. The ability to be in a conversation rather than slightly beside it. The ability to enjoy an evening rather than bracing against what will happen when it ends. Think of someone you have known, or perhaps recognize in yourself, who seemed to have everything under control, who handled difficulty with a composure others admired and perhaps envied slightly, who seemed from the outside to have arrived at some interior peace that most people are still searching for. And then, one day, without apparent cause, something small undoes them completely. A comment that should have bounced off, an ending that, in other circumstances, would have been manageable. A moment of vulnerability that arrives with a force that seems to belong to years, not minutes. Jung was deeply compassionate about this pattern. He did not blame the people who practiced repression. He understood that repression, for most people, began before they had any alternative. It began as the only available response to an environment that could not hold the whole of them. But he also believed and observed, again and again, that what is repressed in childhood does not stay in childhood. It grows, and the longer it waits behind the door, the more insistently it eventually knocks. The answer, and we are moving toward it, is not to smash the door open, not to force a confrontation with decades of stored material in a single desperate evening. It is to open the door gently, just a crack, and let a little light in, because the part of you that has been waiting behind that door is not there to hurt you. It has been waiting to be understood. Chapter 9. Anxiety and the Divided Self. Anxiety is almost never about the thing it claims to be about. This may be the most practically useful observation in all of Jungian psychology, and it is also one of the most counterintuitive, because anxiety presents itself as utterly specific. It knows exactly what it is worried about. It has details, it has timelines, it has a catalogue of worst-case scenarios that feel entirely rational. But the racing heart before a meeting is not about the meeting. The dread that arrives on a Sunday afternoon is not about Monday. Free-floating sense that something is wrong, the sense that follows you into rooms and waits outside the shower and settles into the center of your chest when you lie down at night, that is not about any single external circumstance. It is about a divided self. Jung understood anxiety as a symptom of interior conflict. Specifically, the conflict between what the conscious self is presenting to the world and what the unconscious is pressing toward. Between the life being performed and the life being called for from somewhere deeper, when the persona is demanding one thing and the unconscious is pulling in another direction, the body interprets that conflict as danger. Because from the nervous system's perspective, being split between two competing realities is a form of emergency. Let your breath slow slightly. Let the space around your ribs expand. Consider someone in their 50s, successful by most measures, a life that was chosen, or nearly chosen, or chosen so long ago that the choosing has been forgotten. A marriage that is stable, a career that is respected, children who are not entirely a disappointment, and a quiet, persistent sense of wrongness that this person has never been able to explain to anyone, including themselves. Not depression, not grief, not anxiety about a specific outcome, something more like homesickness. Except they are home. They have read about anxiety. They have done the breathing exercises. They have told themselves often that the thoughts are not real. They have taken the supplements and arranged the sleep hygiene and structured the mornings, and the feeling persists. Because the feeling is not a thought that can be argued away. It is the unconscious saying, "You have wandered from yourself." And some part of you knows it. Jung called this the divided self, not a clinical category, but the natural consequence of living for too long at the level of the persona while the deeper self goes unacknowledged, while the shadow continues to be stored, while the genuine needs of the whole person continue to be managed rather than met. The anxiety in this framing is not the enemy, it is a messenger. It is the psyche's way of saying, something requires your attention, not your management, not your suppression, not your most efficient strategy for making the feelings stop, your honest attention. When you meet anxiety with genuine curiosity rather than immediate control, something shifts. Not dramatically, not overnight. The anxiety does not vanish, but its grip on you changes, because you are no longer confirming its narrative that you are in danger. You are engaging with it. And engagement is not defeat. There is something we will name precisely as this night deepens. For now, just let this sit. The anxiety was never asking to be fixed, it was asking to be heard. And there is something else worth saying here, because it is often the piece that gets lost. Anxiety, attended to honestly, tends to carry information. Not always legible information, not always immediately useful, but information nonetheless. The anxiety about a relationship is sometimes pointing toward a genuine mismatch that the conscious mind has not yet found a way to acknowledge. The anxiety about the work is sometimes pointing toward a value that is being violated by the direction of the work. The anxiety that surfaces every Sunday evening is sometimes pointing toward a life organized around someone else's definition of what matters. None of this makes the anxiety pleasant. It does not make the racing heart or the tightened chest or the sleepless night any more comfortable to live through, but it changes what you do with it. Instead of managing it into silence, you might gently, without forcing, ask, "What are you trying to tell me?" And then wait, without demanding an immediate answer, without filling the space with the noise of solutions. Just wait. The answer comes when it is ready. And when it comes, it tends to be simpler than all the complexity surrounding it suggested. Something true, something honest, something the inner life has been trying to surface for a long time. Chapter 10. The Inner Critic's Voice. Somewhere in the architecture of your inner life, there's a voice that is not quite yours. It sounds like you. It uses your vocabulary. It references your specific history, your particular catalogue of missteps and failures, your unrealized ambitions, and the precise distances between who you are and who you think you should be by now. But it has a quality that a voice genuinely arising from your own deepest self would never have. It is relentless. It does not rest between sessions. It does not temper its judgments with context or compassion. It does not distinguish between the error that genuinely matters and the one that doesn't matter at all. It applies the same severity to forgetting a call as it applies to a moral failure, and it accumulates evidence with the focus of a prosecutor who has decided the verdict before the trial begins. Everything is proof for the same conclusion. Not enough. Not smart enough. Not kind enough. Not productive enough. Not patient enough with the people who deserve more patience. Not brave enough in the moments that required something braver. Jung would identify this voice not as your conscience and not as your wisdom. He would call it a complex, an autonomous cluster of emotionally charged material in the unconscious that has organized itself into something resembling a personality, one with its own energy, its own compulsions, its own persistent agenda. The inner critic is a complex. And like all complexes, it was assembled from experience, from the repeated messages, explicit and implicit, of early life. From the parent whose love arrived inconsistently so that the child learned to monitor their own performance obsessively in search of the pattern that would make the warmth reliable. From the teacher who corrected publicly and praised privately, if at all. From the environment that taught, by its countless small signals, that love was not intrinsic but earned. Let your jaw soften. Let the muscles around your eyes relax. The inner critic is a wound wearing the voice of authority. And the most important thing to understand about it is this: it cannot be defeated through argument. Many people spend years trying to argue with the inner critic, providing counter-evidence, building a case for the defense, pointing to accomplishments, to kindnesses, to the clear evidence of effort and intention. And the critic listens to none of it, because the critic is not interested in being accurate. It is interested in something much more primitive. In some distorted, profoundly misguided way, it believes that if it can keep you small enough, careful enough, self-monitored enough, afraid enough of overreach, it can protect you from the worst thing it imagines. The worst thing it imagines is full visibility, being truly seen, and then found wanting. It is, in its broken way, trying to prevent the pain that it already contains. Think of two voices at 3 a.m. One runs the familiar loop. You should have said more. You should have done differently. You are behind in ways that may not be recoverable. The other is quieter and says something simpler. You are trying. That has always been true. The second voice rarely shouts, it rarely insists. But in a room this quiet, in a night this still, it can be heard, and it is the voice that Jung believed was closer to the truth. Chapter 11: Projection and Emotional Blindness. There is a particular kind of frustration that arrives when someone irritates you, for reasons you cannot fully account for. They said something unremarkable. They made a gesture you have seen 100 times, and something in you went sharp, a heat in the chest, a tightening. You told yourself it was about what they did, and maybe it was, partly. But Jung would have gently suggested that the size of the reaction, the heat of it, the way it lingers, the fact that it returns to your mind hours after the moment has passed, that part was about something else. Projection is one of the most important and most difficult ideas in all of depth psychology. The basic principle is simple to state and almost impossible to fully accept. What we cannot see clearly in ourselves, we project onto others. We attribute to the outer world what is actually moving inside us. The person who reliably angers you with their arrogance may be carrying the ambition you were never allowed to have. The person who exhausts you with their neediness may be sitting directly on top of the need for connection that you have been managing quietly for years. The person whose success fills you with something you don't want to name as envy may simply be living the version of yourself you set aside somewhere in your 30s and decided you were practical enough to do without. This is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be comfortable. Notice where your body holds tension. Let it soften by one small degree. Jung saw projection as a form of emotional blindness that is almost universal. Not stupidity and not moral failure, just the inevitable consequence of not having directly met those parts of yourself that need meeting. Because the unconscious will always find a surface to project onto. If you cannot look at your own anger, you will discover it everywhere around you, in drivers, in colleagues, in news. If you cannot acknowledge your own fear, you will find threat in places that are genuinely safe. If you cannot feel your own grief, you will find yourself unexpectedly moved by things that seem unrelated to anything that actually happened. The feeling has to go somewhere. Projection is where it goes when there is nowhere else available. Here is the practical dimension of this. The next time someone provokes a reaction that feels larger than the situation warrants, a reaction that you notice yourself still carrying hours later, consider sitting with one quiet question. Not, what is wrong with this person? But, what is this feeling pointing toward in me? Not as an accusation, not as a project to complete before sleep. Just as a gentle wondering, held with the curiosity you might extend to an interesting problem rather than an urgent one. The world you see outside is, in part, a mirror. And the mirror is not being unkind. It is offering you back something that has been waiting to be claimed. The irritating person is, often without knowing it, doing you a service. They are showing you where to look. And here is the generous reading of what the irritating person is doing for you. One that Jung would have recognized immediately. Every significant projection is an invitation to retrieve the quality that has been outsourced to the other person and bring it back into your own domain, not to become like them, not to endorse whatever behavior triggered the reaction, but to own the energy that was going into the reaction, because projected energy is energy that is not available for your own life. The person who is spending considerable interior resources being angry at someone else's arrogance is not available in exactly that proportion for the development of their own genuine confidence. The person who is exhausted by others' neediness is not available in exactly that proportion for honest acknowledgement of their own genuine needs. When the projection is retrieved, when the quality is owned rather than attributed, the energy comes home, and that energy, returned, tends to find its way into something that actually belongs to the person claiming it. A direction, a creative work, a relationship conducted with more honesty, a quality of presence that was previously occupied elsewhere. The irritating person did not give you that energy. They reflected it back. And now it is yours to use. Chapter 12, When You Judge Others. Judgment is fast. Compassion takes longer. This is not a moral observation. It is a psychological one. The mind moves toward judgment quickly because judgment gives the ego something it needs. A position, a clear sense of where you stand in relation to the thing being evaluated. Judgment creates a boundary between you and what unsettles you, and that boundary, however briefly, makes the ego feel secure. But here is what Jung observed across decades of clinical work. The things we judge most harshly in others are almost always the things we are in the most complex relationship with inside ourselves. Not always. Sometimes a harmful action is simply harmful, and naming it clearly is a form of clarity, not projection. The mind that judges fairly is a valuable instrument. But the judgment that arrives with sustained heat, that returns uninvited. That carries a particular charge of contempt or dismissal or moral certainty. That judgment is almost always pointing somewhere other than its stated target. Let your breath come naturally. Let your eyes close if they want to. Think of someone you have judged recently, not harshly necessarily, just with a certainty about what they represent or what their behavior reveals about them. And hold very gently this question: is any part of what I see in them a part of me I haven't yet made peace with? The person you find chronically lazy may be resting in a way you have never permitted yourself. The person who frustrates you with their excessive emotion may be feeling things you decided were too much to carry. The person you find disappointingly weak may be showing vulnerability in a form you were trained to despise in yourself. The person you envy most specifically often represents the exact path you abandoned for reasons that seemed practical at the time. This does not mean the judgment is wrong. It means the judgment is incomplete. That it contains information about you as well as information about them. Jung believed that every human being carries within them the full spectrum of human possibility. The capacity for cruelty and for compassion, for cowardice and for courage, for remarkable selfishness and remarkable generosity. No quality belongs exclusively to other people. The qualities we encounter in others and react to with the most force are almost always the ones we have most decisively told ourselves we do not possess. Shadow work, in its simplest possible form, is the practice of looking at those reactions and asking what they might reveal. Not to condemn yourself for what you find, not to collapse into self-criticism in a new direction, but to hold what you find with enough honesty that it no longer needs to live on other people's faces, with enough honesty that the judgment can simply be set down, and something more spacious can grow in its place. There is a kind of freedom in this that has no dramatic announcement. It arrives quietly. The person who previously found a certain quality in others unbearable begins gradually to find it merely interesting. The charge drains away not because they have forced it, but because they have looked at what was beneath it. Jung saw this shift again and again in his clinical work. The person who could not tolerate passivity in others and then discovered, through careful self-examination, how much passivity they had been storing behind their relentless activity. The person who judged coldness in others and found in the examination the place where they had learned to bury warmth. Each recognition reduces the projection, and each reduced projection means slightly less noise in the system, slightly less heat generated by the contact with other people's ordinariness. You cannot do this entirely tonight. It is a life's work, and it proceeds in its own time. But it begins with the willingness to look at the feeling rather than only at the thing the feeling claims to be about. Chapter 13, The Unconscious Keeps Score. There is something your body knows that your mind has not yet accepted. This is not mysticism. It is not philosophy. It is the straightforward observation of a clinician who spent a lifetime watching what happens when the material stored in the unconscious is not attended to. Jung understood the unconscious not as a garbage bin for rejected experience, but as a living, dynamic system that stores what the conscious mind cannot yet carry, processes it according to its own logic, and communicates the results through the channels available to it. When the conscious mind is available and open, the unconscious communicates through intuition, through felt sense, through the kind of knowing that arrives before the argument catches up. When the conscious mind is closed, defended, overloaded, controlled, the unconscious finds its way through symptoms, through the body, through behavior that seems irrational until you understand what it is responding to. The unconscious keeps score not out of vindictiveness, but out of necessity. It holds what the conscious self cannot yet face. And it keeps holding with extraordinary patience until the conditions change. Let your shoulders drop. Let the back of your neck soften. Think about the energy that goes into maintenance. There is the energy you spend on the obvious things, the work, the relationships, the physical upkeep of a life. And then there is the energy you spend on a kind of invisible work, managing what surfaces, keeping the difficult material below the level where it becomes impossible to ignore, maintaining the composure that the persona requires. This second kind of work is exhausting. And because it happens below the level of conscious decision, it rarely appears in your accounting of why you are tired. But the body knows. The body keeps its own ledger. A thinker who studied the long aftermath of difficult experience once wrote something that Jung would have recognized immediately. He said that the body carries what the mind refuses. That healing often begins not with understanding, but with simply becoming safe enough to feel. The connection between the stored material in the unconscious and the experienced quality of daily life is not metaphorical. It is functional. Energy spent in maintaining the walls around stored experience is energy genuinely unavailable for living. This is why people who appear to have everything sometimes feel hollow. The energy is not missing, it is occupied. And this is the practical promise hidden inside the Jungian model of the psyche. The energy held behind the walls does not disappear when the walls come down. It becomes available, not as an explosion, not as a crisis, but as a gradual return of vitality. A gradual lessening of the dull weight that has been there so long it began to feel like your natural baseline. Jung once framed it this way. He said that what remains unconscious will continue to shape your life, and you will experience that shaping as fate. Not as your choices, not as your patterns, but as the world simply doing this to you. Making it conscious is not comfortable, but it is the difference between being shaped by your history and being free to choose something else. That freedom is worth what it costs to find. Chapter 14. Dreams as Hidden Messages. Jung believed that dreams are not noise. This places him at odds with one influential strain of modern thought, which tends to treat dreaming as a kind of neurological maintenance, the brain consolidating memories, processing the residue of the day, generating imagery that means nothing in particular. Jung spent decades observing the opposite. He found patterns in dreams too consistent across too many patients and too precisely relevant to material the conscious mind was avoiding to be explained as random activity. He found that dreams address, in disguised form, exactly the conflicts and avoidances and neglected needs that the conscious mind is most actively refusing to examine. He called this the compensatory function of dreams. The dream compensates for the limitations of the conscious position. It shows the dreamer the angle they have refused to look from. It provides what the waking mind lacks. The person who is performing relentless optimism dreams of darkness. The person who has cut themselves off from vulnerability dreams of floods. The person who has lost touch with their instinctual life dreams of animals, often pursuing, often threatening, often representing the wildness that was domesticated long ago. Not literally, symbolically. And the symbols are personal. Each one emerging from the dreamer's specific vocabulary of experience. Let your eyelids be heavy. Let the breath come slowly. Think about a dream that stayed with you, not necessarily one that seemed significant, just one that left a residue of feeling when you woke. Jung would say that the feeling is more important than the content. The images are the envelope. The emotion that the dream carries into the waking day is the message. What was the feeling? Anxiety, often, but also grief. Also longing for something that cannot quite be named. Also, sometimes, a joy so sourceless and complete that waking into ordinary morning feels like loss. These emotions are the unconscious speaking in the only way available to it when the ego's editing functions are suspended. In dreams, the persona does not operate. The editorial voice that controls the day is asleep, and in that unedited space, the full psyche gets a turn. Jung recorded his own dreams for most of his adult life. He did not treat them as entertainment or curiosity. He treated them as information requiring careful attention. He would sit with a dream for days, sometimes weeks, turning it over, approaching it from different angles, asking not what it means, but what it is pointing toward. He did not demand immediate answers. He practiced what he called active imagination, a deliberate engagement with the material of the unconscious, using its own language of image and symbol. You do not need to practice active imagination tonight. You do not need to do anything. But as you drift towards sleep, consider extending toward whatever your dreaming mind produces a simple quality, curiosity, the kind you would extend to a message from someone who has been trying to reach you for a while, and who deserves at least to be heard. Chapter 15. Symbols from the Deep Mind. The unconscious does not speak in arguments or declarations. It speaks in images. This is one of the places where Jung's thinking becomes most distinctive and most foreign to modern ears, accustomed to the direct, efficient language of facts, reasons, and conclusions. But consider for a moment how you actually experience the things that matter most to you. Not in statements, in images. The memory of a parent is not a list of their qualities. It is a kitchen at a particular hour, a specific smell that still triggers something when it surfaces in an unrelated context, the sound of particular footsteps, the quality of light through a window on an ordinary afternoon when you were 7 years old. The experience of love is not a philosophical argument for attachment. It is a physical warmth, a specific quality of being near a particular person, the way a room changes when they enter it. The experience of loss is not a logical description of absence. It is an empty chair. A sound that used to mean arrival. The reflex of reaching for a phone to call someone who is no longer there. This is the language of the unconscious. Not because it is primitive or underdeveloped, but because it is honest, because it stores experience as it was lived, not as it was later explained. Notice the weight of your eyelids. Let your body sink deeper into whatever holds it. Jung developed a concept he called the collective unconscious, and it was the most controversial and most misunderstood idea in all of his work. He was not describing something supernatural. He was describing a layer of the unconscious that is not assembled from personal experience, not built from the specific history of this individual life, but inherited, part of the architecture of being human, carried in the structure of the mind, the way certain instincts are carried in the body. A vast reservoir of templates, patterns, figures that appear in the myths and dreams and religious imagery of cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and centuries, finding the same shapes emerging independently. The Great Mother who gives life and takes it back. The wise old man who knows what cannot be known by ordinary means. The trickster who disrupts what has become too rigid. The hero who must leave, be tested, and return transformed. The shadow, the double, the dark twin who carries what the hero refuses to carry. These are not literary inventions. Jung believed they are structural patterns in the human psyche, templates that organize experience, generate meaning, and produce the inexplicable sense of recognition we sometimes feel in the presence of certain art, certain music, certain stories that seem to be about something we have never experienced but somehow already know. The deep mind is not foreign, it is not exotic. It is as close as the feeling you had as a child that was too large for any room you were in. That feeling is still there. And tonight, in this particular quiet, it is not far below the surface. Chapter 16, Archetypes in Everyday Life. The word archetype sounds academic, but the experience of meeting one is not academic at all. You have met them. You have met the sage, the older person whose presence had a particular quality, who seemed to know something without explaining how they knew it, whose few words arrived with an accuracy that years of competent advice had never matched. You have met the trickster, the person who arrived and disrupted everything, who made chaos and left, and who somehow left things more alive in the disruption than they were in the careful order that preceded it. You have met the shadow, your own, usually, in moments that surprised you, the cruelty you didn't expect from yourself, the envy that surfaced at a moment of someone else's good news, the anger that arrived in a register far too large for what provoked it. You have met the child in yourself, in the unexpected moments of pure delight or pure terror that cut through the competent adult, and remember, briefly, what it felt like before the performance was required. These are not metaphors Jung imposed on experience. He would say they are the experience itself, described accurately. Let your body rest. Let the air move through you gently. The archetype most central to the journey of this night is the one Jung called the self. Not the ego, not the persona, not the managing, performing, maintaining self that navigates the world. The self with a capital S in Jungian writing is the totality of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious, the known and the unknown, the center that is larger than any of its parts and that exists independent of what the ego believes about itself. Jung believed that the self exerts a gravitational pull on the individual throughout their life. A pull not toward success or achievement or the accumulation of what the world values, but toward wholeness, toward integration, toward the gradual becoming of the full version of what you were from the beginning capable of being. This pull is not always comfortable. It requires giving up smaller versions of yourself that have served their purpose and can no longer grow. Personas that worked for a season but have calcified. Defenses that were necessary once and now cost more than they protect. The pull of the self is what lies behind the feeling, familiar to many people past the midpoint of their lives, that the life they have carefully built no longer fits the person living it. Not because the life is wrong, because the person has grown past it, and the self is pointing quietly toward the next version of becoming. The thread is running, and it runs somewhere interesting. Think of a person who has spent decades successfully performing what their family and culture required of them, who has been, by every relevant measure, exactly what they were supposed to be, and who arrives, one unremarkable Tuesday, at a feeling they cannot name but recognize immediately. The feeling is, this is not actually mine, not the work, not the relationships which are real and important, but the specific way all of it has been conducted, the particular energy expenditure, the role performed rather than the life lived. This is the self insisting on its own existence. Not through crisis, not through dramatic breakdown, but through the quiet, persistent pressure of what has not yet been expressed. Jung believed this pressure was not a symptom of dissatisfaction or ingratitude. It was a sign of health, the psyche functioning correctly, the whole person refusing to be permanently reduced to the part. The archetypes organize this pressure into recognizable shapes. And when you begin to recognize the shapes, you begin to have a choice about how to respond to what they are asking. Chapter 17, The Mother Within. The first world you ever knew was not the external world. It was a person. Before you had language, before you had memory in any form you can consciously access, before you understood what you were or where you were, there was a relationship, the first relationship, the one that taught you, below the level of words and concepts, what to expect from existence. Is the world warm or cold? Is it responsive to my presence or indifferent to it? Is it safe to need things, or is the act of needing itself dangerous? These were not questions you asked. They were answered before you could form questions. And the answers became a template that has been operating quietly ever since, shaping every subsequent experience of closeness, care, and safety. Jung called this template the mother archetype, not the specific individual who raised you. Not a judgment about that person's love or competence or the particular circumstances of your childhood. The mother archetype is the psychic imprint of the first experience of nurturing. The constellation of feelings, expectations, and automatic responses that were organized very early around the fundamental concept of being held. This archetype is one of the most powerful operating forces in the adult psyche. And because it was formed before the ego was organized enough to examine anything critically, it operates most of the time without awareness. Let your breath be easy. Let your hands rest open. It speaks in the way certain environments feel. The safety that descends in a particular kitchen or a particular quality of afternoon light, something that makes no practical sense but produces a palpable ease. Or the opposite, a tightening that arrives in certain situations without apparent cause, a vulnerability that feels suddenly childlike, a need that you cannot explain in adult terms. It speaks in what you seek from relationships. Whether you move toward people who provide a quality of steadiness that functions like being held, or toward people who need that from you. Whether closeness feels like coming home, or whether it triggers the ancient fear that closeness will be taken away. The mother within is not a wound or a gift in itself. It is a history. And, like all histories, it becomes most useful when it is known rather than simply repeated. Think of someone who has spent their life caring brilliantly for others while deflecting any care directed back at them. Who says they are fine when they are not? Who finds genuine kindness from others uncomfortable, a little embarrassing, something to be quickly redirected? That person is not cold. They are not selfish. They are holding a very old story. A story that told them, before they had language to question it, that their needs were too much, that the safest way to be loved was to need nothing. One of the gifts this kind of inner work offers, slowly, without forcing, is the recognition that the story was not the truth. It was the conclusion available to a very small person in a very limited situation, and you are not that small anymore. Chapter 18. The Father Within. If the mother archetype is the first world, the father archetype is the first law, the first encounter with structure, with limit, with expectation. The voice that said, directly or by implication, this is how things are done. This is what is valued. This is what earns belonging and what forfeits it. And again, not the specific individual who filled that role, but the psychic imprint of authority, of the standard, of the measuring. The Father within is the voice that sets the bar, and for many people, the bar was set at a height that was never meant to be reached, not from cruelty in most cases. Often from love, from a father who worked relentlessly and needed his children to understand what work required. From a father who was afraid of failure and communicated that fear as expectation, not recognizing how the child received it. From a father who was absent, physically or emotionally, and whose absence the child interpreted, as children will in the absence of other information, as evidence of their own insufficiency. The inner father lives in the standards you hold yourself to, in the evaluative voice that appears before you have even finished the thing being evaluated, in the math that never quite adds up to enough. Notice the quality of your breath. There is nothing required of you right now. But the father archetype is not only criticism and limit. At its best, at its healthiest, it carries something else entirely. The belief that you are capable of more than you think, the willingness to hold you to a standard not out of withholding, but out of genuine respect for your potential. The voice that says, "I know you can do this, and I will not pretend you cannot simply to make this moment easier." Many people carry only one half of this archetype, either the relentlessly evaluating version, which produces the inner critic that never rests, or the entirely permissive version, the absence of internal structure which produces its own particular difficulty. The person who cannot hold themselves accountable, who finds every standard someone else's imposition, who struggles with the beautiful difficulty of making genuine commitments. The integration of the father archetype means finding both halves, the capacity for honest self-assessment and the capacity for genuine self-belief. The willingness to acknowledge where you fell short and the willingness to acknowledge where you did not. Both of these are available. Not from outside, not from any particular person, but from the inner life you are slowly turning toward. Jung believed that the adult who has not examined the parental archetypes is not making free choices. They are living on a script written before they were old enough to question it. The examination is not blame. The examination is simply the beginning of authorship. There is a difference between the person who lives inside a story they did not choose and the person who has read the story carefully enough to know where they stop following it and begin writing their own. Think of someone who grew up with a father who communicated love through achievement, who praised outcomes and was quiet about effort, who, without ever saying it directly, taught that the gap between where you are and where you should be is the most important distance in the room. That person carries an inner father who never quite allows rest, who treats every accomplishment as the new baseline, who counts the distance remaining before the celebration of the distance traveled. This is not the father's fault, necessarily. The father was likely passing on his own inherited standard. But the examination, the honest, curious, non-accusatory examination, is the discovery that this voice in your head is not the truth about your worth. It is a story about a particular family's relationship to safety and approval, and you are allowed at any point in your life to write a different one. Chapter 19. Anima, Desire. And longing Jung observed that the human psyche is not as cleanly divided as culture tends to suggest. His clinical work led him to a conclusion that required careful articulation then and requires the same care now. Within the male psyche, he identified a feminine presence he called the Anima. Within the female psyche, a masculine presence he called the Animus. These terms are not about gender stereotypes. they require care in handling. What Jung was describing were psychological functions, dimensions of inner life that carry qualities the dominant personality has often not developed or has actively suppressed. Let us sit, for now, with the anima. Jung understood the anima as the inner image of the feminine within a man's psychology. Not femininity as culture defines it, but the specific psychological capacities associated with the interior life. Emotional awareness, imagination, the capacity for wonder, the ability to remain in uncertainty without forcing a resolution, the reaching toward beauty and connection, and the irrational. For men raised in contexts that rewarded logic over feeling, stoicism over vulnerability, certainty over openness, and there are many such contexts, the anima often goes underground. The emotional life is not eliminated. It is transferred to the anima, which then communicates through indirect channels, through the inexplicable response to certain music, the longing that arrives on a long drive without an obvious object, the quality of sadness that settles during certain autumn evenings and cannot be explained by anything that has actually happened. Let your body be soft. Let the room hold you. The anima also projects. When a man is not in relationship with his own interior emotional life, when the capacity for vulnerability and feeling and genuine openness has been stored in the anima rather than lived directly, he will tend to project these qualities outward. He will find them in actual people, particularly in romantic relationship. This is one of the reasons new love can feel so overwhelming, so complete, so much like being found after a long and unacknowledged searching. It is not only the other person that he is responding to. It is his own projected inner life, finally finding a face he can look at. And this is, tenderly, one of the reasons that relationships change when the projection begins to withdraw. When the actual person stands in front of the projection, complex and contradictory and ordinary in the way real people are ordinary. The grief that sometimes arrives at that moment is not only about the relationship, it is about the parts of himself he still has not found. This is not a diminishment of love. Love is real. Genuine connection is real and irreplaceable. But the part that seeks completion in another person is always also a direction pointing inward, toward what has not yet been found at home. What has not been found at home is not a quality borrowed from another person. It is a dimension of yourself that has been waiting for direct relationship. The emotional vocabulary, the capacity to sit with beauty without immediately being productive about it, the willingness to not know, the ability to feel moved by something without needing to explain why. These are not qualities that belong exclusively to certain people. They are interior capacities. Human capacities that many people, through the specific pressures of their formation, learned to assign to others rather than claim as their own. The novelist, who has been thinking in images for 30 years and never given themselves permission to follow it. The engineer who finds certain music almost unbearably moving and has never told anyone. The executive who reads poetry in the early morning before the rest of the world is awake and experiences it as a kind of secret that would make no sense in the afternoon. The inner life is richer than what has been permitted. The work of developing a relationship with the Anima is not about becoming emotional in some performed way. It is about the gradual recovery of parts of the inner life that were stored rather than developed. And the permission is yours to give. It always was. Chapter 20, Animus, Thought, and Defensiveness. The other side of this has its own particular texture. Jung's concept of the animus, the masculine principle within the female psyche, is the most contested dimension of his work, and the most easily misread. So care is warranted. He was not describing a personality type. He was not saying women carry an internal version of some simplified idea of maleness. He was describing a psychological function, the inner dimension that carries structure, assertion, clarity of conviction, the capacity to take up space, to say clearly what one thinks, to stand behind one's own perception without apologizing for its existence. When this function is underdeveloped, when a person has spent their life adapting, softening, accommodating, offering their certainties for others' comfort and pulling them back when they produce discomfort, the animus tends to emerge in a distorted form, not as healthy conviction, but as a kind of inner dogmatism, as voices that arrive in the night with pronouncements rather than questions, a sudden, brittle certainty on certain subjects that doesn't quite connect to the evidence in the room. A defensiveness that feels like it is about the current conversation, but is really about something that has no place in the current conversation. Notice the breath. Let it slow without forcing it. The animus, like the anima, is looking for a conscious relationship. It wants to be developed and owned, not suppressed and projected. Because projection is always what happens with undeveloped psychological functions. The person who has not made friends with their own directness will often find it threatening or infuriating in others. The person who has suppressed their own logical capacities will sometimes feel inexplicably destabilized by people who deploy those capacities comfortably. The mirror, again. The unconscious content showing itself on an exterior surface. The practical invitation is not to undertake a program of psychological development tonight. That is too large for any single evening. The practical invitation is simpler. Notice where you feel most brittle, not in an obvious conflict, but inside yourself. The place where challenge feels like attack. The place where you find yourself defending something you did not consciously choose to defend. That brittleness often marks the location of the undeveloped function, the place where the most significant growth is waiting. You are not trying to change yourself tonight. You are only trying to see yourself a little more clearly. And that seeing, however slight, is already doing something. It is worth saying what the healthy version of the Animus looks like, because Jung's concept is not, finally, about dysfunction. It is about potential. The well-developed Animus in a woman's psychology is the capacity for her own clear, unqualified thinking, not borrowed thinking, not the ventriloquism of other people's convictions, her own. The ability to have an opinion about something and hold it steadily under pressure without either collapsing it or defending it with excessive force. The ability to say, "This is what I actually think," without the qualifier, without the preemptive apology, without the question mark that was placed at the end of every strong statement long before she understood why. This is not aggression. It is the psychological equivalent of standing on solid ground, and many people spend much of their lives without that ground beneath them, borrowing certainty from relationships, from institutions, from the consensus of the people around them, rather than developing it from within. The path toward the inner ground is not taken through any single insight. It is taken through repeated small acts of trusting what you actually think. One conversation at a time. One moment of saying the honest thing rather than the accommodating thing. The ground builds slowly, but it builds. Chapter 21. Self-Sabotage and Secret Loyalty. There is a behavioral pattern that looks, from the outside, like failure, like self-destruction, like a person who cannot get out of their own way, who repeatedly defeats goals that they sincerely say they want, who approaches the threshold of something genuinely good and then, reliably, finds a way to step back from it. The jobs that were within reach and weren't pursued. The relationships that reached a certain intimacy and then collapsed without clear cause. The creative work begun with genuine energy and then abandoned at exactly the point where it would have required genuine risk. The pattern is too precise to be random, too consistent to be explained by circumstance, and it is often invisible to the person inside it. Jung's framework of complexes provides one of the most useful explanations available for this pattern. When a cluster of unconscious material, a set of beliefs, emotional memories, early experiences organized around a central theme, has developed enough density and energy to operate independently, it begins to exert its own gravity on behavior. Some of those complexes carry a specific, deeply embedded belief. The belief is not, "I will fail." It is more specific than that. It is, "People like me do not succeed at this." Or, "If I reach for this, something essential will be taken from me." Or, "There is a version of success that requires me to leave behind the people and the story I came from, and I would rather stay small than make that crossing." Let your body be still. Let your hands rest open. This is what Jung sometimes gestured toward when he described how family and cultural mythology shapes individual fate. Not the explicit messages, but the implicit ones. The story the family system tells about itself, about who rises and who doesn't, about what kind of ambition is acceptable and what kind invites punishment from life. A child absorbs that story below the level of words, and the story becomes a loyalty to the family's collective self-image, a loyalty to the version of the world that everyone around you agreed on, a loyalty to the prediction that things of a certain kind go wrong, because if the prediction is honored, at least the world makes sense. The sabotage, then, is not self-destruction. It is faithfulness. Faithfulness to a story that was written before you arrived, and that you have been living without having been shown the text. Recognizing this pattern does not immediately end it. Patterns with roots this deep were formed before language, and they do not respond to argument or to a single night's insight. But recognition changes the quality of what is happening. The behavior can no longer be entirely invisible. You begin to notice the moment the step back begins. You begin to see the familiar threshold, and what you can see, you can eventually choose differently. You are not broken, you are loyal, and you are allowed to decide, slowly, that this particular loyalty has served its purpose. Chapter 22. Trauma and the Split Psyche. Jung was working with what we would now call trauma long before that concept had its current form, its current name, its current understanding. He saw it in his clinical work with the consistency and specificity of someone observing an actual phenomenon, not theorizing about a hypothetical one. He saw the split quality, the person who functioned perfectly well in the outer world, competent, reliable, present in every practical sense, and who nonetheless carried within them another kind of presence. A younger, more terrified, more unformed piece of psychic life that surfaced in certain relationships, in certain situations, in the body's unexpected responses to what should have been ordinary moments. He called the mechanism dissociation. The split of a piece of psychic material from the rest of the psyche, not its destruction, but its isolation, a walling off of what could not, at the time, be metabolized. The split is a form of mercy. When something happens that the developing psyche cannot process, cannot hold within the existing structure of the self without structural collapse, the psyche does what any intelligent system does. It quarantines. It places the material behind a barrier, not permanently, with the implicit intention to return when conditions allow. The problem is that the conditions often do not allow for a long time, and behind that barrier, the material does not age. Let your breath come slowly. Let the night be quiet. This is why certain things hit with a force that has nothing to do with what just happened. A tone of voice that is not even directed at you, that floods the adult nervous system with a child-specific terror, a particular dynamic in a relationship that opens a grief that is decades old. A minor failure that carries the weight of every failure that ever preceded it, stacked invisible and heavy behind it. The adult is not overreacting. The adult is responding from two places simultaneously, from the present moment and from an old moment that has never been fully metabolized, that time left untouched behind its barrier. Jung's approach to this was patient and deeply respectful of the psyche's own timing. He did not recommend forcing the quarantined material into consciousness through acts of will. He understood that the barriers were there for reasons, and that removing them before the self was large enough to hold what was behind them could cause more harm than the original injury. What he recommended was companionship, moving toward the material slowly, with curiosity rather than confrontation, with the warmth of a present self that is finally large enough to hold what the younger self could not. The split psyche does not require surgery. It requires the patient, gentle work of integration. The walled-off piece needs to be told what the child who stored it most needed to hear, that it is safe now, that you are here, that it does not have to stay alone behind the wall. This is a kind of inner parenting. The present self, with the resources of adult life, the perspective, the capacity for self-compassion, the understanding that the original situation was limiting rather than final, returning to the stored material with the warmth that was not available at the time, not to relive the original experience, not to excavate and dramatize, but to bear witness to it with honesty and without the judgment that the young self turned on itself in the absence of any other explanation. Young children who are not safe do not conclude that their environment is unsafe. They conclude that they are inadequate, that there is something wrong with them that accounts for the difficulty. This conclusion, formed in the only logic available to a small person in a large and confusing world, tends to persist long after the environment has changed. The adult who finally examines this conclusion is not rewriting history. They are simply replacing a child's explanation with an adult's understanding. The environment was difficult. The child responded as intelligently as any child could. The strategies that were developed were genuinely the best available at the time, and now new strategies are possible. Because the self that is doing the examining is not the self that originally stored the material. It is larger, and the larger self can hold what the smaller self could not. Chapter 23. Why success still feels empty. The achievement arrived. The goal was reached. And then, often sooner than expected, the feeling of it began to thin. Not all at once. The relief was real. The satisfaction was genuine, for a day or two, but it did not deepen the way the long approach toward it suggested it would. It did not settle into the kind of peace that was supposed to come at this particular finish line. And then, quietly, the restlessness returned. The same restlessness as before. The same sense of something unfinished, unnamed, circling at the edge of a good life. This is one of the most common experiences people bring to serious reflection, and one of the most confusing, because it violates the agreement most people have made with their ambition. The agreement says, work hard enough, long enough, smartly enough, and eventually you will arrive somewhere that feels like home, and you arrive, and it does not. Let your breath slow. Let your eyelids soften. Think of a man who has kept himself intensely busy for 40 years. Not accidentally busy, deliberately, precisely, strategically busy in a way that has served every practical purpose and left almost no time for the kind of interior stillness that asks uncomfortable questions. One Sunday, the calendar is empty. The schedule has nothing in it. And in the emptiness, without the structure of tasks to organize himself around, something surfaces. Not depression, not regret, something quieter than both. The question, who am I when I am not useful? The question had been waiting for 40 years. The busyness had been, in some sense, a magnificent answer to it, or rather a way of preventing it from being asked. Jung would point gently toward the distinction that matters most here. External success is real. The achievement is real. The accomplishment is genuine and worth something. But meaning is not a byproduct of achievement. It is not produced by accumulation or performance. It is a quality of relationship. Relationship to your work, to your life, to the specific, unique story of who you are and what you are doing here. And the ego, for all its remarkable competence, cannot manufacture meaning. It can acquire. It can outlast. It can optimize. But it cannot make a life feel significant from the inside. For that, something deeper needs to be consulted. The self. And the self does not want a larger salary or a more impressive title. The self wants authenticity. It wants to feel that the life being lived belongs to the person actually living it. The hollow place inside success is precisely the distance between the life that was built for external approval and the life that was needed for interior meaning. It is not a failure, it is a direction. The self pointing again toward the path that was always waiting. Here is the thing about this hollow feeling that is worth saying clearly. It is not ingratitude. People sometimes experience it as ingratitude or as a kind of spiritual failure, as though they should simply be more grateful for what they have, and the hollow feeling is evidence of some moral deficiency. It is not. Gratitude and the hollow feeling can coexist without contradiction. You can be genuinely grateful for what is real and valuable in your life, while simultaneously recognizing that a significant portion of your energy has been directed toward an external destination that the inner life never requested. The hollow is not saying you chose wrong. It is saying you chose partially, that the conscious mind made its selections with competence and genuine effort, but that the deeper layers of the self were never fully consulted. And the deeper layers have been patient. They have been patient through the building and the proving and the accumulating. But their patience is not infinite, and the hollow feeling is the most benign form of their insistence. The more dramatic forms, the breakdown, the sudden inexplicable change, the late-life disruption that others find inexplicable, tend to arrive when the quieter insistences have been ignored for a very long time. The hollow feeling, attended to honestly, is a gift. It is the self speaking while there is still plenty of time to listen. Chapter 24: Leveling Up Without Performance. There is a version of self-improvement that is simply the persona renovating itself. New habits assembled like new furniture, new language borrowed from whatever vocabulary is currently most credible, new identity markers attached to the outside of a self that has not meaningfully changed at any deeper level, all of it oriented outward, all of it asking at the root the same anxious question it was always asking: am I the right kind of person now? Jung had no enthusiasm for this version of growth, not because he didn't believe in genuine change. He spent his entire career watching people change in the most profound ways, at levels that altered not just behavior but the fundamental quality of who they were. But because he understood that change at the surface, without corresponding change in the unconscious, is renovation rather than transformation. You can renovate a building without addressing the foundation. The building will look better. The rooms will feel different. But the structural crack will find its way back through the new paint. Because nothing that was causing the crack was ever examined. Real growth, in Jung's understanding, moves in a different direction. Not upward exactly, deeper, inward, into the material that has been stored rather than the performance that has been assembled. Let the night be around you. Let your body rest. Here is the difference between the two kinds of growth made concrete. One person learns a set of meditation techniques to manage anxiety. They practice regularly. The anxiety decreases noticeably. The techniques are working, and then, some months later, the techniques begin to lose their effectiveness. The anxiety finds new roots. The person feels, frustratingly, as though they are back where they started, because the material underneath the anxiety was never addressed. It was quieted, and quiet and resolved are not the same thing. Another person notices their anxiety and makes a different move. Instead of asking how to stop it, they ask what it is saying. They sit with the discomfort, not to enjoy it, but to listen to it. They allow what surfaces to surface without immediately acting on it or managing it. They bring curiosity to the material. Over time, over months rather than days, the anxiety changes. Not because it was suppressed, but because it was, for the first time, genuinely heard. The second person is not working harder. They are working at the level where the work actually needs to happen. And the depth is not about discipline or willpower or any quality that can be performed. It is about willingness. The willingness to be honest about what is actually moving inside you, rather than what you have decided you are supposed to feel. Leveling up, in the real sense, is not the accumulation of impressive qualities. It is the slow, patient, and sometimes uncomfortable subtraction of what was never truly yours. The mask worn for approval. The belief inherited but never examined. The story about yourself that began before you could question its premises. Each one you release makes the one who remains a little more genuinely real. And real, it turns out, is the only version of yourself that can ever feel at home. Chapter 25. Individuation beyond approval. Here, finally, is the word individuation. This is Jung's name for the process that has been running beneath every chapter of this night's conversation. The slow, lifelong, often uncomfortable, ultimately essential process of becoming genuinely yourself. Not the self that was assembled to earn approval from the specific people in the specific rooms of your early life. Not the self that was shaped by the accumulated pressure of cultural codes and family mythology and the persistent human need to belong. Not the self that is carefully maintained in the present to avoid rejection, to sustain connection, to keep the world feeling recognizable. The self that existed before any of that. That continues to exist beneath all of that. That the unconscious has been pointing toward. Through symptoms and dreams and moments of inexplicable restlessness and hollow success for as long as you have been alive. Individuation is not a destination. It is a direction. You do not arrive at it. You move toward it. And the movement, the faithful, patient, imperfect movement toward greater honesty with yourself, is itself the point. Jung once wrote that the person who looks only outward is dreaming. The person who turns their gaze inward with genuine honesty and genuine courage begins to awaken. Let that settle. Not as a demand, not as another item on the list of things you haven't yet accomplished. Just let it open. Earlier tonight, I asked you to hold something. The question of two kinds of thinking. One that exhausts, one that heals. Here is where we can answer it fully. The thinking that exhausts is ego-level thinking. It circles because it is trying to control an outcome. It replays because it is managing a threat. It plans compulsively because certainty feels like safety. It is the thinking of a self that is afraid of what happens when it stops. The thinking that heals is something closer to listening. It goes inward rather than around. It asks what is true rather than what should be true. It makes contact with what has been waiting. It does not produce outputs immediately. Its fruits take longer to appear. but they appear. And what they produce is not more efficiency or more performance. What they produce is integration, the gradual bringing together of the pieces that were separated, the gradual arrival of a self that is large enough to hold its own complexity without being destroyed by it. This is individuation for a whole life, without a finish line, without the expectation of arrival. And the extraordinary thing Jung discovered, again and again, in himself and in the people he worked with, was this: the self revealed through that inward listening is always more interesting, more complete, and more capable of genuine peace than the self that was being performed, always. You do not need to perform tonight. The night is for something else. There is a final thing worth saying about individuation before we move on. It is not a project with a deadline. It is not a therapeutic protocol with a prescribed number of sessions. It is not something you can complete by a particular age or demonstrate by a particular outcome. Jung was nearly 70 when he wrote some of his most important work on individuation. He was still in the process himself. He expected to be until the end. This is not discouraging. It is the opposite. It means that wherever you are in your life, whatever age, whatever the specific mix of what has been built and what has been lost and what has been found and what remains unfound, you are exactly at the right place in this process. There is no behind. There is no version of this where you started too late or did not do enough of it early enough. There is only the direction, and the direction is inward, and the path inward is always open. Chapter 26. Letting go of false selves. Every version of yourself that was assembled in order to belong to someone else's world can, in time, be gently set down. This is not rejection. It is not about deciding that the people you adapted for were wrong, or that the accommodations you made were failures. Most of those people were doing the best they could within their own limitations. Most of them were passing along adaptations that had been required of them by someone earlier in the chain. It is about recognizing now that the accumulated weight of those adaptations is not who you are. It is what you carried, with considerable skill and sometimes considerable cost, in order to find a place where you could exist. And the question from this particular vantage point in a life is whether you need to carry all of it in exactly the same way. Think of the night when you let go of a dream, not dramatically, quietly. A dream that had been yours for years, a specific future, a particular version of yourself you had intended to grow into, that you recognized one ordinary evening as no longer fitting the person you had actually become. It was not failure. There was no dramatic moment of decision. It was more like the quiet recognition that a coat you had been saving no longer fit. That the shape of who you had grown into was different from the shape the coat was made for. Letting go of a false self has exactly that quality. Let your body be heavy. Let the night be kind. It does not feel heroic. It rarely looks like anything from the outside. It is not announced. It feels like the slow, honest recognition that a way of being is costing more than it is giving, that the role requires more energy to maintain than the benefits justify, that the person playing the role is exhausted by the distance between the performance and the truth. And then, over time, not through a single decision but through a series of small, honest moments, a gradual setting down. Jung observed this process most often in the second half of life. Not because midlife is the only time it can happen, but because by midlife, the performance has usually run long enough that the cost of continuing it has become genuinely impossible to ignore, the success that doesn't satisfy, the relationship that has become a habit rather than a choosing, the identity that made complete sense at 30 and sits increasingly loosely at 55. These are not failures of the first half. They are the psyche's insistence that the false selves have served their purpose. They are the self calling you home, not to somewhere new or distant or difficult to reach, to somewhere original, to the version of you that existed before the first mask was fitted and that has been waiting patiently for you to have enough space to remember it. Here is what that version feels like when you encounter it, even briefly. A quietness that is different from the quietness of exhaustion. A sense of being simply here, without the effort of maintenance, without the energy expenditure of performance. A recognition, not triumphant, not dramatic, that this is the actual ground. That everything built on top of it was built by people doing their best in circumstances that required adaptation. And that the adaptation served. But the ground was here the whole time. Jung observed that people who had done substantial interior work often described a particular quality of restfulness that was different from any they had known before. Not the restfulness of not caring, they often cared more deeply than ever, but the restfulness of no longer being at war with themselves, of no longer spending the enormous energy required to maintain the distance between who they were showing and who they actually were. That energy, recovered, does not produce a dramatic transformation visible to anyone outside. It produces a quiet, sustained, and entirely specific quality of being more fully alive in the life you are actually living. Chapter 27. The Psychology of Detachment. We have come back to where we began, but now we can see it from the inside. Detachment, in the Jungian sense, is not coldness. It is not the practiced emotional distance of someone who has been hurt enough times to have decided that feeling is not worth the cost. It is not indifference dressed as wisdom. It is the freedom that comes from having met yourself honestly, from having looked at what was in the shadow and not been destroyed by it, from having recognized the persona for what it is, a useful instrument, not the whole truth, from having made contact with the unconscious and discovered that it is not the enemy. When you know what you actually feel, you do not need external circumstances to define it for you. When the shadow has been examined, The things other people project onto you have less power to stick. When the persona is understood as a tool, approval stops being an emergency. This is detachment. Not detachment from life or from the people in it. Detachment from the desperate need for life to look a particular way in order for you to be allowed to feel that you are enough. Let your breath be slow. Let the room be simple and close. Jung described the journey of individuation as a gradual shift in the psychic center of gravity, not from the ego to something formless or mystical, but from the ego to the self. From the managing, performing, controlling center to the larger, quieter center that holds the whole. When you live from the ego alone, you are always at the mercy of events, because the ego draws its sense of safety from what it can see, control, and predict. And life does not reliably provide those things. But when the center of gravity has begun to shift toward the self, toward the part of the psyche that is in relationship with its own unconscious, that has made some peace with its own shadow, that has some familiarity with its own depths, then the ground beneath you is different, older, less dependent on what happened today. From this ground, genuine detachment becomes possible, not because you have stopped caring, but because you have found something to care from that is deeper than any outcome, a truth worth holding here, and we will carry it gently through what remains of this night. The truly detached person is not the one who feels nothing. They are the one who feels everything and is not overwhelmed by it, who can hold grief and gratitude in the same hand, who can face uncertainty without converting it into emergency, because they have something that the relentlessly managing, controlling, anxious self does not have. They have a self that is large enough to hold what arrives. You are building that self right now, in this quiet. Think about what has happened in the hours of this conversation. You have not been asked to solve anything. You have not been required to produce anything or demonstrate anything or arrive at any particular conclusion. You have been asked only to listen to the ideas, yes, but also to whatever arises in you in response to the ideas. The recognition when something lands that is genuinely true for you. The resistance when something is not quite right. The unexpected emotion that surfaces not because the narrative has done anything dramatic, but simply because the quiet has made room for what was already there. That listening is the practice, and the self that listens honestly, without defense, without the immediate deflection of what is uncomfortable, that self is growing. Not toward a destination, toward a fullness that was always possible. Detachment, finally, is this. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a self large enough to feel everything without being defined by any single feeling. The wave passes through you and you remain. This is what the work is building. One quiet night at a time. Chapter 28. loneliness on the inner path. There is a dimension of the Jungian journey that is not often spoken about. The inner path can be lonely, not in the way of social isolation. You can be surrounded by people who love you genuinely and still feel this particular kind of loneliness. It is not about who is in the room. It is the loneliness of becoming someone that the people who knew the previous version of you do not entirely recognize. Of growing in a direction that does not match the identity everyone agreed you were. Of sitting with questions that others are not asking. Of finding meaning in things that the ordinary rhythm of life does not create space for. Of needing more silence than the day offers, more depth than the conversation provides, more honesty than the role requires. This loneliness is real. And it is important to say that it is not evidence of having done something wrong or wandered somewhere you shouldn't be. It is the natural companion of genuine growth. Let your body rest. Let the air be soft around you. Jung himself knew this loneliness in specific biographical terms. His intellectual path diverged sharply from the consensus of his time. His break with Freud cost him the professional community he had belonged to. His interests in myth, alchemy, symbol, the religious dimensions of the unconscious, placed him at the margins of scientific acceptability and kept him there for decades. He pursued his path anyway, not out of stubbornness, but because the alternative had become unavailable. You cannot unknow what you have come to know. You cannot return permanently to a smaller version of yourself once you have had a genuine encounter with the larger one. There is an old story of a student who has traveled a very long way to find a teacher and ask a single question. The teacher receives the student on a mountain path in the evening. The student asks the question, the teacher listens carefully, and then says nothing. The silence continues. The light changes. The student waits, and after a long time realizes that the answer was never going to arrive in words. That the teacher's presence, the quality of attention given to the question, the refusal to replace genuine uncertainty with a convenient answer, these were the teaching. The deepest companionship on the inner path is often wordless. It arrives in certain books that seem to have been written specifically for you at a moment you couldn't have predicted. In certain pieces of music that reach somewhere the conversation never quite gets. In the simple fact, received with gratitude, that someone was here before you and found it worth documenting. Jung is one of those companions. He did not claim the inner path was comfortable. He did not pretend that the discoveries were always welcome, but he walked it carefully and he left a trail. You are not alone here. You are simply in territory that most people do not visit in the day. But the territory is real. It has always been real. And it has its own kind of companionship. There is a certain quality of recognition that passes between people who have been on this path for a while. Not a recognition based on shared beliefs or shared vocabulary, a deeper recognition. The recognition of people who have both turned toward the interior and found it worth turning toward. You can find it in certain books, in certain pieces of music that seem to know things about you, in the conversations that happen at unusual hours when the ordinary social performance has been set aside and something more genuine becomes possible. This recognition is not rare, precisely, but it requires a certain willingness to be found. The willingness to be honest about the questions you are actually living with, to admit, even to yourself, that you are genuinely uncertain about things the ordinary day does not create space for uncertainty about. That willingness, and it is available to you right now, in this particular quiet, is the door. You are already through it. And that willingness, the curiosity that brought you to a conversation like this one, that has kept you here through this long and useful night, is itself the evidence of the self already turning toward its own depth, already engaged in the work, already in its quiet way becoming. Chapter 29. Silence as emotional healing. In a cold room in Paris in the early 1660s, a brilliant and chronically ill philosopher named Blaise Pascal wrote one of the most uncomfortable sentences in the history of ideas. He wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from a single source: the inability to sit quietly alone in a room. Pascal was not being poetic or exaggerating for effect. He was being precise. He had observed, in himself and in everyone around him, a profound and ceaseless flight from interior silence, a preference for almost any kind of activity, entertainment, argument, ambition, distraction, the social performance of being someone doing something, over the bare experience of being alone with oneself. And in that preference, he saw the root of an extraordinary amount of suffering. The noise we surround ourselves with is rarely about enjoying the noise. It is, most often, about avoiding the quiet, because in the quiet, things surface. Let your breath come naturally. Let the silence of this moment simply be what it is. Jung understood silence not as emptiness, but as a specific quality of presence. The condition in which the unconscious can begin to communicate without being continuously drowned out by the traffic of the ego. The ego prefers noise. The ego has opinions about the noise. The ego manages the noise. Silence removes the ego's primary material, the external world to react to, and leaves it facing itself, which, predictably, the ego finds uncomfortable. But the discomfort is not the silence's failure. It is information. It is the announcement that there is material here below the surface of the busy day that has not been given space, and the emotional healing that arrives in genuine quiet, the kind available in a room this still, at an hour this late, is not mystical in its mechanism. It is simply the removal of the conditions that were preventing something from moving, the grief that couldn't arrive at 3 p.m. because the afternoon didn't have room for it. The tenderness toward yourself that was always being postponed by the next demand. The quiet awareness of what you actually want, as distinct from what you have been working toward. silence does not create these things. It makes room for them to arrive on their own schedule, and their arrival, even when it aches slightly, is a form of coming home. You have been in this silence for a while now. This particular quality of quiet, with these particular ideas moving through it. Notice what is different about this hour compared to the beginning of it. That difference, however subtle, is what Jung meant when he talked about the work. Pascal, writing in his cold room 300 years ago, saw something with remarkable precision. He understood that the flight from silence was not a personal weakness, but a structural feature of human society. That the busyness and entertainment and social performance that fill almost every available moment are not coincidental arrangements. They are organized, consciously and unconsciously, around the avoidance of what silence reveals. And what silence reveals is not something terrible. It is not, usually, the darkness that people fear. It is more ordinary than that. It is the feeling of being simply here, without the identity provided by what you are doing or who you are being for someone else. Without the constant self-narration that maintains the coherent story of a continuous self, just here, just breathing, just present in a way that the busy day never quite allows. This is the quality that certain traditions have called presence, or awareness, or the still small voice. Jung called it the experience of the self beneath the ego. Whatever the name, the experience is available. It is available right now. In the quiet of this particular room, at this particular hour, where nothing is required of you and nothing needs to be proven, you are already in the condition most people spend their lives arranging to reach. Let it be enough to simply be in it. Chapter 30. The Wounded Healer Within. There is an old figure in Greek mythology that Jung found particularly resonant, Chiron, a centaur, half man, half horse, in the form the Greeks gave to that particular combination of instinct and intelligence. A healer, a teacher of heroes. He taught Achilles, he taught Asclepius, who became the god of medicine. He was widely regarded as the wisest of his kind and one of the most knowledgeable in the ancient world, and he was permanently, incurably wounded. He was struck by a poisoned arrow, accidentally, by a hero he had once served, and the wound could never be healed, not by any of the knowledge he possessed, not by any of the skill he had spent centuries developing. He carried it for the rest of his immortal life, and he continued to heal others. Jung saw in this figure something he had observed again and again in his clinical work, in the healing arts more broadly, and in his own experience. The wound does not disqualify you from wisdom. Sometimes the wound is precisely where the wisdom lives. Let your body rest. There is nothing required here. Think of a therapist sitting with someone in their very first session. She asks a question that is simple on the surface. How would you speak to yourself if you spoke the way you speak to your closest friend? The patient opens their mouth, and stops. They realize they have never tried. The question has never occurred to them in 40 years of living inside their own head. That therapist's ability to ask that question in that way, in that moment, with that particular quality of recognition, did not come from a textbook. It came from years of personal work with her own inner critic, her own difficult history, her own wounded place, and the long, patient practice of developing compassion for it. She heals from the wound, not despite it, from it. This is what the wounded healer archetype describes. Not a romantic notion, not a consolation prize for having suffered. A functional truth about how human wisdom actually moves. What you have moved through, the grief that required years, the fear that was never named, the part of yourself that was stored behind the wall, these are not liabilities. They are a vocabulary. They allow you to speak a language that people in the same territory immediately recognize because the experience it comes from is real. Your wounds, met honestly and carried with some degree of integration, become the precise resource needed to reach others who are suffering in the same landscape. But the word others is not quite the point tonight. The point is that the wounded healer is available inside you, not for the benefit of anyone else. For your own navigation of this life, the part that suffered can become the part that understands. That is not a small thing. Jung once reflected on the particular kind of knowledge that suffering makes available. He was careful not to romanticize it. He had no interest in the idea that suffering is good or necessary in itself. He understood that it is simply something that happens, that it is neutral in its occurrence and not neutral in its consequences. The consequences depend entirely on what is done with it. The suffering that is never examined, never integrated, never brought into honest relationship with the rest of the psyche tends to repeat. In different forms, in different relationships, in different chapters of the same essential story. The suffering that is met with the same quality of curious attention that Jung brought to everything, that suffering tends to become something else. Not a wound that has been heroically overcome, but a depth, a texture, a specific kind of presence that can recognize certain things in others that cannot be recognized any other way. This is the wounded healer's real gift. Not the performance of having survived, but the genuine knowledge of what the terrain feels like. And that knowledge is available to you, not for others necessarily. First, and most importantly, for yourself. Chapter 31. Mental clarity through integration. The mind becomes clearer not when it empties, but when it integrates. This is one of the more counterintuitive dimensions of the Jungian model. The contemporary approach to mental clarity tends toward subtraction. Remove the noise, quiet the thoughts, reduce the stimulation, empty the mind until something like peace can exist in the space. And there is genuine value in that. Rest is real. Reduction of stimulation has its legitimate place. But the deepest and most durable clarity does not come from quiet alone. It comes from integration. Integration means bringing the fragmented pieces of the psyche into a working relationship with each other. The shadow and the persona. The wounded piece and the present adult who can hold it now. The inner critic and the quieter, more honest voice beneath it. The anima or animus and the dominant personality. The ego and the self. When these pieces are in active conflict, the mind is noisy. Not because noise is its natural condition, but because the ongoing work of managing the conflict requires enormous resources that would otherwise be available for actual presence. When the pieces move toward relationship, not resolution, not agreement, but genuine relationship, the management effort decreases, and the energy freed by that decrease returns to living. Let your breath be slow. Let your eyes stay closed, if they are closed. Here is what integration looks like in the texture of an ordinary day. You notice an emotion. You do not immediately explain it away or use it to justify a reaction. You pause, even briefly, and ask, "What is this?" Not to diagnose or analyze, but simply to give it a moment of honest attention. You feel irritated. And rather than immediately finding the external cause and going toward it, you allow for the possibility that the irritation is pointing somewhere inward, a need that was overlooked, a boundary that was crossed without being named, an old story reactivating in a familiar costume. You do not need to have the answer immediately. You do not need to have the answer tonight. You only need the pause, that small space between the emotion and the reaction, that space in which, as a very wise man once said, your freedom actually lives. The mind that has been practicing that pause for months, for years, has a different quality than the mind that has never been offered it. It is not empty. It is not painless. It is not without difficulty. But the difficulty no longer runs the room. The difficulty is held alongside everything else by a self that has become large enough for the holding, and from that larger self, something that has the quality of genuine clarity becomes possible. Not the clarity of having all the answers, the clarity of no longer being at war with the questions. Jung described a particular quality that became available to people who had done sustained interior work. He did not have a single dramatic name for it. He described it in various ways across his writing, but the consistent element was this: a quality of steadiness that was not dependent on external circumstances, remaining favorable, not optimism, not the belief that things would work out well, something more durable than that, the steadiness of a person who has sat with their own darkness and found that the darkness did not destroy them, who has looked at the shadow and discovered it contained not only what was difficult, but what was genuinely vital? Who has made enough honest contact with the unconscious to know that it is not the enemy? From this steadiness, clarity is possible in a way that it never quite was when the ego was managing everything alone. Because the ego's clarity is always conditional. It depends on the right information, the right circumstances, the right level of certainty. It is, in a sense, clarity that is always one surprise away from collapsing. The clarity that comes from integration is different. It does not require certainty. It can remain present in ambiguity. It can hold the question without needing to collapse it into an answer. And it is available to you, not as a destination to reach, as a quality that grows, slowly and without drama, in the soil of honest self-attention. Exactly the kind of attention this night has been practicing. Chapter 32. Freedom from Overthinking. Overthinking ends the way a long fever ends. Not abruptly. Not through force of will. Not through the application of a technique, however skillfully applied. It ends gradually, as the conditions that produced it begin to change. And the conditions that produce overthinking are specific. They are the underlying unmet needs, the anxiety about whether you are enough, the unprocessed grief that has nowhere else to go, the conflict between what is being performed and what is actually true. The question the mind keeps returning to because it has never been given an honest answer. When those conditions are addressed, not solved, not eliminated, but genuinely attended to, the overthinking loses the urgency that powered it. The loop continues to offer itself for a while. Old patterns have momentum. The neural pathways of rumination are well worn and remain available, but the pressure that drove the thinking releases. And in that release, something the looping mind was searching for all along becomes available. Rest. Let your breath be easy. Let the night hold you without asking for anything. We planted 2 questions at the beginning of this conversation. Hold them now, gently. The first was about the 2 kinds of thinking. One that exhausts, one that heals. The thinking that exhausts is ego-level thinking. It circles because it is trying to prevent a loss. It replays because it is managing a wound. It plans incessantly because certainty feels safer than the open question. It is working very hard and working against the current. The thinking that heals moves in a different direction, not around, but down. It asks what is actually true rather than what should be true. It follows the feeling rather than trying to eliminate it. It makes contact with what has been stored, with what has been waiting, with the material that the loop was always pointing toward and never quite reaching. Freedom from overthinking is not achieved by fighting the thoughts. It is achieved by giving the part of the mind that was generating the thoughts what it was actually asking for. To be heard, not managed. Heard, to have its underlying need recognized, named, and held with some degree of honesty. You have been doing this tonight, not through effort, through willingness. The willingness to stay in the territory of the inner life, to let these ideas move through you rather than past you, to hold the questions without forcing them into answers. That willingness is the practice, and the practice, sustained over time, is freedom. There is something worth naming directly now that we are near the end of this long night's journey. The freedom from overthinking that Jung's work points toward is not the elimination of thought. Thought is not the problem and never was. The restless, looping, replaying thought was always a messenger, always pointing towards something that needed attention. What the freedom looks like on the other side of having attended to that something is not silence in the mind. It is thought that moves rather than loops. Thought that engages with what is present rather than what is feared or what is already gone. Thought in the service of understanding rather than in the service of control. The mind is still active. The mind was always meant to be active, but its activity now has a different quality, less desperate, less driven by the unacknowledged pressure of what has been stored beneath the surface. The person who has done even a modest amount of genuine interior work, who has begun to know their shadow, who has some relationship with their complexes, who has practiced the pause between stimulus and response, that person thinks differently. Not better, exactly, not more cleverly, with more honesty. And honesty, it turns out, is what the mind was always actually seeking through all that noise. Chapter 33. Becoming who you are. There is a phrase that appears in slightly different forms across the traditions Jung spent his life studying. Become who you are. It sounds paradoxical. You are already who you are. How can you become what you already are? But Jung understood the paradox completely. Because most of what people experience as themselves is assembled. It is the persona and the inherited story and the adaptive self shaped by what the situation required rather than what was genuinely true. The self beneath that assembly is real. It has always been real. It has been patient and persistent and present even through all the accommodations. It speaks in the moments of unexpected recognition, in the things that move you without apparent reason, in the dream that stays past the morning, in the feeling of wrongness, in a life that by every external measure should feel right. Becoming who you are is the work of uncovering that self, of removing, one honest layer at a time, what was placed over it by circumstance and expectation and the reasonable demands of a life lived among other people. This is not dramatic. It rarely produces a single transformative moment. It does not tend to look like anything visible from the outside. It looks like a person who has stopped performing a quality they do not actually possess. Like a person who begins to say what they mean in one conversation and then in another. Like a person who discovers, in their 50s, a genuine interest they set aside at 20 and quietly returns to it without permission, without announcement. It looks like the gradual settling of a life into its actual shape. Let your body be completely still. Let your eyes rest behind closed lids. Jung observed this process most often in people past the midpoint of their lives. Not because the work cannot begin earlier, it can, and it sometimes does, but because the first half of life has a different imperative. The first half of life is legitimately about building, about establishing, about constructing the vessel, the identity, the role, the relational world, the livelihood, the basic architecture of a life in the world. But the second half is fulfilling the vessel, not with more achievement, with meaning, with the specific, unrepeatable, genuine content of who you actually are. The writer who finally writes the thing they were afraid to write. The person who stops managing their feelings and begins to feel them fully for the first time. The man who, in a quiet moment, forgives himself for the version of himself he was in his 30s, not excusing it, but releasing the grip of it. These are not failures of the first half, they are the gifts the second half makes possible. You are in this process. You have been for longer than you may have had a name for. Now you have a name, individuation. Becoming, slowly and honestly, the full version of yourself that was always possible. And there is one more thing Jung observed that is worth carrying into the final part of this night. The person who moves toward genuine selfhood, who individuates in however halting and imperfect a way, tends to become more useful to others, not less. This is the paradox. The self-work that can look self-absorbed from the outside, the turning inward that can seem like withdrawal, the honesty about one's own darkness that can seem indulgent, these processes tend to produce, over time, a person who is more genuinely present to the people around them, because the person who knows their shadow can meet the shadow in others with tolerance rather than judgment. The person who has made contact with their own wound can sit with someone else's wound without the need to fix it immediately. The person who is in honest relationship with their own fear has less need to pretend that fear does not exist in themselves or in the room. Genuine selfhood, in the Jungian sense, is not isolation. It is the foundation of genuine connection. Because you can only truly meet another person at the depth to which you have met yourself. And the meeting, when it happens, is the most valuable thing available in this particular existence. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Chapter 34. A life aligned with soul. Soul is not a religious word in the Jungian sense. It is a psychological one, and a precise one. It refers to the deepest layer of inner life, the dimension of the psyche that knows what it wants, not through argument or calculation, but through resonance, through the felt sense of recognition that arrives when something is genuinely true for you, as distinct from what you have decided is true or what others have told you should be true. Soul is what stirs when a piece of music arrives at the exact right moment in your life. It is what aches when something genuinely beautiful is witnessed. It is what goes quiet and large in the presence of a grief that is too significant for the ordinary mind to manage in its usual efficient way. Soul is the part of you that knows. A life aligned with soul is not a perfect life. It is not a comfortable life in the ordinary sense, and it is not a life without difficulty. It is not a life that has arrived at some destination of spiritual achievement. It is a life in which the choices made carry an interior truth, in which the direction of movement feels genuinely chosen rather than defaulted into, in which the person who lies down at night is, in some fundamental way, the same person who woke up in the morning, not performing, not managing, present. Let your breath be long and slow. Let the room hold you. Jung believed this kind of alignment becomes more available, not less, as people age and move through the experiences that strip away the unnecessary. The young person is rightly occupied with building. The imperatives of the first half of life, establishing, proving, constructing, demand a certain outward focus, a certain surrender to the requirements of the world outside. But the person who has spent decades building and who arrives, sometimes gradually and sometimes suddenly, at the questions of what the building was for, that person has the remarkable opportunity available only from this particular vantage point, the opportunity to stop, to ask, maybe for the first time in genuine honesty, what they actually want from the remaining years. Not what would be admired, not what makes sense according to the story everyone has agreed on, not what they chose at 25 and have been loyal to out of inertia ever since, what they actually, genuinely, specifically want. This question does not need an answer tonight. It can simply be held. But holding it with honesty, letting it live as a real question rather than a rhetorical one you already know the answer to, is already a movement toward the aligned life, toward the self that has been waiting with considerable patience to be genuinely consulted, toward the life that was always, underneath everything else, yours. There is a quality of alignment that most people have felt briefly at some point in their lives. A moment, an afternoon, a day, in which everything felt genuinely connected, in which the activity was real, the presence was full, and the gap between the inside and the outside had, for that duration, closed. It is often remembered as one of the best times, and it is remembered that way not because anything particularly dramatic happened, but because the self was genuinely present in it. Jung believed that this quality, available to most people in glimpses, is the natural state of the individuated self. Not a peak experience to be recalled with nostalgia, but a gradual and sustainable quality of living that becomes more available as the integration deepens. Not perfect, not without difficulty, not free of the grief and uncertainty and loss that are simply part of being alive, but genuinely inhabited. The person who lives an aligned life is not necessarily successful in any conventional sense. They are not necessarily comfortable or admired or free of complications. They are simply recognizably themselves. And that particular quality, that recognizability, that sense of a person who is where they actually are, is not common. But it is what this night's conversation has been, in its quiet way, building toward, and it is available to you. Chapter 35. Night thoughts grow gentle. There is a change that happens slowly, almost imperceptibly. As the inner work deepens over time, the night thoughts change. Not all at once, not permanently or uniformly or dramatically. But you begin to notice at some point that the 3 a.m. loop is quieter than it used to be, that the replayed conversation has less of the charge it once carried, that the weight in the chest at this hour is not always dread. Sometimes it is simply the natural quietness of a mind that has been given something it needed. This is not resignation. It is not the emotional flatness of someone who has stopped caring. It is something more like trust. A trust built not from positive thinking or from persuading yourself that everything will be fine, but from a deeper and more honest kind of knowledge. The knowledge that you have already survived far more uncertainty than what currently sits in front of you. That the capacity to navigate difficulty is not something you are waiting to develop. It is something you have been using your entire life, without always recognizing it. And the knowledge that the unresolved thing, whatever it is, does not require resolution tonight, that tomorrow is real, that the self has resources. Let your body be heavy everywhere it can be heavy. Let your eyes stay closed. Jung believed that as the process of individuation deepens, the relationship to the unconscious changes character. What was once experienced as threatening or invasive or simply incomprehensible begins to feel more like a resource. The material that arrives in the night is no longer only anxiety and unfinished business. Sometimes it is genuine information. Sometimes it is the dream that carries exactly the image needed for tomorrow's understanding. Sometimes it is the simple, sourceless warmth of a self that is, slowly, becoming more fully at home in itself. Think of a friend you became to yourself, not all at once. Through a long process of incremental honesty, the first time you noticed the inner critic and named it rather than believing it. The first time you extended yourself, even briefly, the gentleness you would have given without hesitation to someone else. The first time a kind thought about yourself arrived and you let it stay, rather than immediately arguing with it. That friendship with yourself is what is being built here in these chapters, in this particular kind of quiet. In the willingness to sit with the questions Jung spent a lifetime asking. The overthinking has less power not because it has been defeated, but because it has been understood. Because the self underneath it is more present than it used to be. Because there is something now that can hold what arrives, rather than only brace against it. The night thoughts grow gentle, not silent, but gentle. And gentle is enough. There is a quality of evening, late, deeply quiet, the kind of quiet that can only exist after a very long conversation has finally said what it needed to say, in which the mind simply stops insisting, not through defeat, through satisfaction, through the particular kind of satisfaction that comes from having been genuinely attended to. The mind that was looping because something underneath it needed attention. And the attention, provided slowly and honestly over the course of this night, has shifted something in the weight of it. Not resolved, not finished, not done with in any permanent sense, but lighter, less urgent, carrying, perhaps for the first time in a while, a quality of being accompanied rather than driven. This is the gift of the kind of thinking Jung spent his life developing and pointing toward, not answers. Companionship. The companionship of a self that is willing to sit with its own complexity in the dark for as long as it takes for the gentleness to arrive. It has arrived. Let the rest of the night be yours. Chapter 36. A quiet return to wholeness. We began tonight with a mind that would not rest, with the familiar quality of a day that was over but not yet released, with thoughts still moving, still circling, still doing the relentless work of a self that had not yet been given permission to simply be still. We have traveled a long way from that beginning, through the shadow and the persona, through the ego's need for control and the unconscious that keeps its patient score, through projection and the inner critic, through the archetypes that organize experience before experience can be named, through the parental imprints and the Anima and Animus, through self-sabotage and the split psyche and the hollow quality of success that was built at the wrong level. And we have arrived at the word that holds all of it: individuation, the direction of a whole life, the gravitational pull of the self toward greater honesty, greater integration, greater alignment between who you appear to be and who you actually are, not to answers. Jung was never interested in the person who believed they had found the answers. He thought the questions were more alive, more honest, and finally more useful. We have arrived, instead, at better questions. Not what is wrong with me, but what is this feeling asking for? Not how do I stop thinking, but what has not yet been allowed to speak? Not who should I become, but who, beneath all of this, have I always been? Let your body be completely heavy. Let your breath be slow. Let your hands rest open, palms up at your sides. Feel the openness of that posture. Not emptiness, openness. This is the posture Jung would have recognized. Not the clenched grip of the ego managing everything it can see, but the open hand, the willingness to receive what arrives rather than only pursue what was planned. Earlier tonight, in the first minutes of this conversation, there was a mind that would not rest. That mind has been listening for a long time now. And what it has been listening to is not, finally, a set of ideas. It has been listening to something older and quieter than any idea. The voice of the self that was whole before the first accommodation was made. The self that held its wholeness through all the years of adaptation and performance and careful management. The self that the unconscious has been pointing toward in one form or another for as long as you have been alive. Jung once wrote that the person who looks outward is dreaming. The person who looks inward awakens. And waking, in this particular context, does not mean becoming alert and restless again. It means arriving at the stillness that is not the absence of life, but its fullness. The wholeness that was always here, that has been here, patient and complete beneath everything. Let your breath slow to its natural depth. Let the thoughts move where they want to move. You are not required to follow them or manage them or do anything at all with them. You have listened deeply tonight. You have done your work. You are enough, and the night is yours. The mind that started this journey still turned outward toward a world of assessments and replays and preparations. That mind has been taken somewhere different tonight. Not dramatically different, incrementally different, but the increment is real. Something has been heard that needed to be heard. Something has been recognized that was waiting for recognition. Something has shifted by the smallest degree in the direction of what Jung spent his life pointing toward, the direction of wholeness. Not wholeness as a destination, wholeness as a quality of relationship with yourself. The ongoing, imperfect, deeply human practice of meeting what is actually there with honest attention and something resembling kindness. This is available to you every time the world goes quiet, every time you set down the phone and lie in the dark, every time the ordinary noise recedes and something older and quieter gets a turn. It does not require anything you do not already have. It only requires the willingness to listen. And that willingness, the krika, willingness that brought you here, that kept you here through all these hours of ideas and stories and quiet, is evidence of something that matters. It is evidence of a self that is already, in its own patient way, turning toward its own wholeness. That self is here, in this room, in this quiet, in this body that has been breathing gently through this entire long and useful night. Let it rest now. Sleep now.